Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec, where we talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life feels like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach. And today we're talking about what happens after the toxic relationship ends. After the narcissist, after the manipulator, after the gaslighting, after the chaos. This episode is titled, Healing After Toxic Relationships, Rebuilding Trust Without Becoming Guarded. And if you've ever thought, I never want to feel that way again, but also worried at the same time, I don't know how to let anyone close without losing myself. How do I let somebody in again? This episode is for you. I'm going to start by talking about the post-toxic paradox, because so often we view toxic relationships or toxic engagements as something we need to get out of, and we make the false assumption that once we're out, we're in the clear, and nothing can be further from the truth. There's a moment after a toxic relationship ends that no one really prepares you for. It's not relief, it's not freedom, it's vigilance. You're out. You're free and clear, so to speak, but your nervous system doesn't know that yet. So you scan, you hesitate, you second guess, you pull back, and you tell yourself, I'm just being careful. But here's the paradox. What feels like protection can quietly turn into isolation. And what you call boundaries can slowly become walls. One of my biggest pet peeves on social media, and I see it a lot on TikTok, I see it a little bit on Instagram and Facebook as well, is the so-called relationship coaches. Now, there are wonderful coaches out there that have developed their coaching skill through training, of course. Some have developed it through life experience. I'm not going to talk shade against them. I do have concerns that if people have not been properly trained in coaching or trained as clinicians, as I've actually been trained in both. I think it is risky for people just to say, I went through a divorce and now I'm a divorce coach. Lived experience is important. I never imagined that I would be a divorce and relationship coach until I went through a divorce. The difference is I've been trained in coaching. I hold a doctoral degree in clinical and forensic psychology. I have an extreme depth and breadth of clinical experience over 20 years and coaching experience that I bring to the work I do. I'm not somebody that just experienced something, took a 1-hour course online, and suddenly is throwing out on TikTok that I'm a coach. All right, enough of that negativity. But here is my genuine concern. There are coaches that don't have the depth of clinical understanding or coaching understanding that will understand some of the difficulties that people experience related to the post-toxic paradox. Some do well, and that's wonderful, but others don't. And many will have hard and fast rules, such as you came out of a bad relationship, you need to go no contact, or you can't date anyone for a year. It's a hard and fast rule. And I don't like hard and fast rules. And the reason is because as humans, we are infinitely complex. And when one human meets another and wants to try to form a relationship or a bond, that complexity just multiplies. And there's so many variations that occur. And so my approach to these types of things of the post-toxic paradox and post-toxic relationship is it's not about an arbitrary timeline that you throw on somebody. And if you're working with a coach who is saying to you, with hardly knowing you at all, oh, you can't date for at least 6 months minimum, be very cautious and perhaps walk away from that, because the concern is there are nuances to this process. And the real question is, how have you healed? What have you learned? How have you grown? And how are you taking that forward in your future relationships? That is what is going to determine when you are ready for that next adventure, for that next romantic relationship, or that next intimate relationship. And that, for some of us, could happen within weeks or months. Others, it might take a year or longer. One quick example, when I went through my divorce, because of my way of processing things, and because I was struggling in the relationship and for months, certainly years going into it, and my ex and I, who to this day are very amicable and supportive of one another, we approached things differently. I did a lot of my grieving before I left. I did a lot of my soul searching and growing before I left. I still had some to do after I left, of course. There's always some of that. But much of what I had to do, I did before I left, so that once I left and I went through the initial phase of sadness over weeks and maybe a couple months, in fairly short order, I was ready. And it was literally within a few months that I met my current fiance. That was we're 3 years down the road. We didn't rush into anything, but I was open because I knew that I had done the work and I knew I was at a place that I was comfortable and ready to let somebody in, or at least begin to let somebody in. And the worst thing I see are people that have these hard and fast rules. I can't date for 6 months. I can't date minimum for a year. I can't be open to talking with somebody that I might be interested in. And that's when the universe actually puts love in front of them and they miss the opportunity because of their rigidity. Some of you need hard and fast rules because you keep falling into things and you get caught up. There's nothing wrong with having discipline, but it's not about a timeline. It's about finding out when are you ready based on the healing and the growth that you've done, and if you think you can bring your full self into that next relationship. All right. Sorry about that tangent, but it's something I feel very strongly about and something I see a lot of misinformation on the internet about. So, as I was saying, what feels like protection can quietly turn into isolation. And if we add additional rigid boundaries on top of it, I'm going to be talking about boundaries in the next episode, by the way, then what you call boundaries can slowly become walls. And that's what you want to avoid. So I'm going to talk for a moment about why guardedness does make sense as an initial reaction. So let me say this clearly. If you've been through a toxic relationship, becoming guarded is not a flaw. And everything I just said, I don't want you to read it as guardedness or black and white thinking is a flaw. It's not. The question is, how is it working for you at your stage of growth and healing? So guardedness is and can be an intelligent response post-toxic relationship. Your nervous system learns something important in that process, right? It learned that closeness can also be dangerous, that vulnerability can be used against you, and that trust can cost you your clarity, your confidence, and even your identity over time. And a big part of that identity loss is we stop trusting ourselves. We stop trusting our own judgment. So now your system does what it was designed to do. It protects. And the problem is protection and healing are not the same thing. Protection and healing are not the same thing. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me unpack why the statement, I'll never trust again. I'll never fall in love again. I'll never open myself up to someone again. All of those are a trauma response. So when people say those things, I'll never trust anyone again, what they're really saying is, I don't trust my ability to protect myself. What they're really saying is, I don't trust my judgment because trust was outsourced. You outsource that trust to somebody else. You put that in somebody else. And here's the rub. If you ever want to be in a trusting, loving, positive relationship, you need to do that again. You need to outsource your trust. You need to start with trusting yourself, but at some point you need to put trust in the hands of another. And yes, there's a risk that that can be betrayed. But after coming out of a relationship, you're feeling these things. It is normal because when you outsource it and when boundaries were ignored and red flags were explained away or ignored and the cost was high, that's what creates this feeling of not wanting to ever trust again. It's kind of like the first time you jumped off the high dive. Maybe that went very well, but for some of us, it didn't go well. Maybe we flopped. Maybe we didn't go in the right way and it hurt a little bit. Many of us wanted to say, I'm never doing that again. But for most of us, we did do it again. We dusted ourselves off. We got up. We realized, okay, that injury doesn't define me. And we moved beyond it. And that's really important, right? I heard a great quote not long ago that I love about red flags. It's a therapist asking her patient, her client, didn't you see the red flags? And the client says, sure, I did, but I thought it was a carnival. And I love that because even when we see red flags, we can explain them away. We can rationalize them away. And that's important to keep in mind. But all of that is part of this process that leads us to have a post-toxic reaction of I'll never trust again. So now the nervous system swings to the opposite extreme. I opened up to you. I became vulnerable. I trusted. You hurt me. And now in order to protect, I'm going to swing completely in the opposite direction. No trust, no risk, no vulnerability. And while that feels safe, it's also really lonely. And if you're doing that based on rigid ideas, as I talked about a few minutes ago, you might be cutting yourself off from that person in your life that's ready to go to the next step with you. And that is deserving of it. And you're deserving of their love as well. So it is a delicate balance. Again, social media is filled with here's real simple rules to follow because those are wonderful for 30-second sound bites. I'm not giving you that bullshit here. This is complex stuff. You have to do the work. You have to look deep. And from that, though, you'll come out the other end with a very clear and open understanding of who you are, what your boundaries are, and what your needs are. And you'll also have discernment, the ability to discern when you can trust again and when you can't. So what is the difference between trust and discernment? It's really important that we make that. And I talk about this all the time in my coaching. I have a lot of people that come to me for relationship and separation and divorce coaching. And they've actually done a lot of work. And they've watched all the social media clips and they've got little tidbits of the good insights, right? But they haven't developed discernment yet because they haven't had a coach or a therapist that has walked them through the process and helped them really get to the tough corners of themselves to understand how this works. This is one of the most important distinctions you can make. Trust is not blind openness. Discernment is not cynicism. Trust says to you, I assume safety. So that's what trust says. It assumes safety is there. Discernment says safety is earned. And toxic relationships, many people confuse discernment with guardedness, but they're not the same, not at all. Guardedness says no one gets access. I'm not letting anybody in. Or you need to work for a very, very long time before you get in. And guess what happens to the other person? They check out, they move on. There's a window of engagement that happens when we meet people or when we start dating, that if we're not aligned, if we're not close enough to one another, one of those people moves on. Think of two planets that for some reason start passing each other and they start slowing down into each other's orbit and they start rotating each other. In a relationship at the very beginning, it's like those two planets are first kind of coming together. And if the forces are such that they start actually rotating in sync and orbiting each other, they have a very tight gravity. They have a tight connection. But if they do that for a little bit and then they start going separate more and more and more, then one of them flies off into space. And that's one of the difficulties of finding that balance of how guarded to be versus open. And slowly letting that openness and that trust, and for what we're talking about now, discernment, allow that to lead the process. Because if we're too guarded too long, people are going to move on. So again, guardedness says no one gets access. Discernment says access is gradual. Guardedness shuts down everything. Discernment slows everything down. So Some of you might be thinking, okay, maybe I know this, or maybe hopefully this is insightful. But even if you've worked through some of this, you might be asking yourself, so I worked through some of it. I let go of the grief. I let go of the anger. And now I'm just kind of in a calm state. I think I'm finding who I am. I think I've got decent discernment, but calm feels boring. It's so fucking boring. Let's unpack that. Why calm feels boring after chaos. And this is a hard truth for many people to hear. After chaos, calm can feel empty. After intensity, stability can feel flat. And after you're in a trauma bond, consistency can feel unfamiliar, because that's not what a trauma bond is. A trauma bond is one day one thing, the next day another thing. It's intense, it's chaotic, it's unpredictable. And our nervous system gets familiar with that. So consistency and peace and calm begin to feel unfamiliar. Your nervous system became accustomed to adrenaline, unpredictability, emotional highs and lows. So when things are healthy, they don't register as exciting. They register as quiet. And many people mistake quiet for a lack of connection. It's not. It's regulation. It's important to remember that. Just this morning, I was in the shower listening to a podcast, which I sometimes do when I wake up and kind of get ready for the day. And my fiance was getting ready and putting, as she says, putting her face on, putting her makeup on. And she was listening to a podcast that she does as well. And there was an old moment for me where if I'm not talking to my ex-wife in the morning when we were married, but it goes even before her, to people I dated before I was married, my partner would be like, why aren't you talking to me? We're not close. We're not connecting. Why, put down the phone. Why aren't you engaging with me? And I could see how there's a point to that at some point, right? If I'm buried in my phone all the time, I could see how my partner feels disconnected. But what was so nice about this morning is the quiet peace of me listening to a podcast, my fiance listening to her own podcast or listening to music. We were okay in the quietness between us. I mean, we were in our own little world, of course, yes, listening to our own thing, but our connection, our trust, our calmness, the regulation of our nervous system, we were okay in the calm between us in the morning. We didn't need to fill it with talk just for talk's sake. And so that is regulation. That is a good thing when you can get there. So let me give you a case example. Dating after toxicity. I once worked with a client who said this to me. It was a woman, and she said, he's kind, he's consistent, he really communicates well, and I don't feel anything. There's no rush, there's no excitement. She was convinced that something was wrong, that she was broken, that she'd lost her ability to connect. But what she was really actually experiencing was the absence of chaos. Her nervous system didn't know how to interpret safety yet, because we can move on intellectually fairly soon or think we want to move on. You could listen to this podcast and say, oh my God, George, I love that shit. I want all of that. And you could convince your head of that. It's going to take your nervous system a while to catch up. It's going to need a while to put its shoes on and catch up to you on that. But what she was really experiencing was that absence of chaos, right? And she didn't know how to interpret safety. Once we slowed things down and talked it through and unpacked it in the coaching we did, we let her system recalibrate and something shifted. She started saying, I realized calm wasn't boring. It was just unfamiliar. Those are not the same. Many people overeat because they're bored. They're not hungry. They're bored. And that is unfamiliar. So they want to fill it with something. And in this case, they literally fill it with food, right? That realization, though, of that calm wasn't boring, it was just unfamiliar, that changed everything for her. And it allowed her to step more into the relationship in a way that where she can give herself more and not feel that the calm was a negative. So you might be in a place right now where you are moving off a relationship or thinking of moving off a relationship, or you could be stuck. You could be a year or two down the road saying, why am I still in a funk? Why can't I kind of move forward and begin to trust again? I'm going to flip that on its ear a little bit. And this is why you don't need to trust. You need to observe. You need to start with observation. And this is something I teach in my coaching. Here's a reframe that helps many people. You don't need to trust someone right away. You need to observe them. How do they handle frustration? How do they respond to boundaries? How do they repair when they make a mistake? How do they act when you disappoint them? These moments reveal far more than chemistry ever will. Healthy people don't punish boundaries. They respect them. They don't escalate when told no. Even if upset, they don't escalate. They seek understanding before judgment. They don't collapse when you're honest. They lean in. They appreciate it. They validate it. And they don't disappear when things slow down. They go into the calm with you. They embrace it. It might be unfamiliar for them too. So realize that in the earlier phases of a relationship, you're both learning and growing, which is another little diatribe I'm going to go on to. We have this culture of instant gratification. We have this culture of perceived unlimited options. Think of Tinder or Bumble or Match.com, right? And we have this culture where there's so many messages of people should love me and like me for who I am today. I'm perfect the way I am. And all three are bullshit. I'm sorry, I'm calling it out. They're ultimate bullshit. Now, there is a reduction of delay of gratification, or there is an increase in instant gratification. Amazon is a great example of that. I decide today that I need some kind of back scratcher. I go on Amazon and within 3 hours, it's at my door. Bam, it's there. That's something we have to fight against because relationships don't work that way. The perception of unlimited options. Dating sites do connect people. I'm not against dating sites. I think you have to approach them in a very particular way. And I talk this through in my coaching. But that said, it does give us this sense that there's unlimited options. I could swipe and review 100 women profiles in about 10 minutes or 15 or 20 minutes. That gives you the sense that there's always more fish out there. And arguably there are with billions and billions of people on the planet, but that isn't something that's viable. And if we have that sense of unlimited options available to us, and we have a sense of, I don't need to change, the world should love me just the way I am, we are going to set ourselves up for disappointment. So many people that come to me for dating advice and coaching related to dating relationships, many, even just really good people, and I'm not talking about narcissists here, not at all, good people with a good sense of self, they still are over-calibrated through multiple messaging of, I don't need to change. I'm exactly perfect. Not perfect, but I don't need to change. Someone should love me the way I am. But the reality is there is a certain marketability to us in the dating world, right? To both. We are observing another, and guess what? Another is observing us. How's our hygiene? Could we lose a few pounds? Could we get into better shape? Could we just take better care of our health? Could I work on my speaking and social awkwardness ability? Can I work on articulation training where I'm clear in my thoughts? Is my impulse control reasonable that isn't threatening to another person? There's a number of things that we can work on to improve ourselves. And we should improve ourselves for us. Yes, of course. But it also has a fallout effect. It improves our relationships at work. It improves our likability at work. Likability in the corporate and in the work world usually means you're more likely to get promoted and people like working with you. And likability or amicability in the dating world also doesn't hurt you. It's a positive, right? So all of that relates to this notion of observing and being aware of what are the things that we want in others, but what are the things that we can change for ourselves as well. So you don't need to trust someone right away. You need to observe them, how they handle frustration, boundaries. What happens when they make a mistake? Do they try to repair? How do they act when you disappoint them? Those moments reveal far more than chemistry, quote unquote, chemistry ever will. Healthy people don't punish boundaries. They don't escalate. They don't collapse, and they don't disappear. So from that, how do you begin to rebuild trust safely, step by step? Again, if you're in that place where you're having a hard time trusting others, maybe you're having a hard time trusting yourself. your own judgment. You're beating yourself up. Why did I get in that relationship? Why did I let him or her treat me that way? Why did I lose myself? Here are some thoughts. Healing after toxic relationships, it's not about jumping back in. It's about intentional pacing. And here's what that looks like in real life. You slow the timeline down. You delay emotional disclosure. Notice I'm still not putting rigid boundaries. This is a cadence issue. It's not a firm timeline issue. So I'm saying slow the timeline, delay emotional disclosure. I'm not saying arbitrarily decide for 6 months, I'm not going to date anybody. For 6 months, I'm not talking to a man or a woman. That dream person could walk into your life in 3 weeks and you're closed off. But you do want to slow it down, right? You let consistency precede intimacy. You watch behavior over time. You allow the other person to demonstrate to you what they're able and willing to bring to the relationship. That's discernment. You tolerate discomfort without rescuing. And then you don't explain your boundaries. You don't over-justify your needs. They are what they are. Someone might need to understand where the boundary or needs lie and what they are, but you don't have to justify them. And you don't override your instincts in order to keep the peace. And most importantly, you listen to your own body. Remember, all of this ties back to your nervous system. Your nervous system is going to take its time to recalibrate and re-regulate. You need to listen to that. And that time isn't arbitrary. That time is on its pace and your pace. It's not on some coach on TikTok saying, don't date for a year. And if something feels off, here's the beauty of this. You hit the pause button. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you're with somebody that cannot understand that, they don't get it then. Maybe that's not your person, or maybe that's not your person right now. So you don't hit the panic button, you hit the pause button. And in this process, you're going to learn to trust yourself again. The deepest injury in toxic relationships is not what they did. It's what you stopped doing. You stopped trusting yourself. You questioned your own perceptions. You questioned your own reality. You minimized your needs. You ignored your intuition. So building trust starts internally. It starts with honoring small signals, discomfort, confusion, unease. Those aren't inconveniences. Those are information. Those are pieces of important feedback. Lean into those. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Get comfortable allowing those signals to inform you, to impact you, and then act accordingly. And if those are good signals, you move closer. And if they're bad signals, maybe you move further away, or maybe you just hit the pause button for a bit. Nothing's wrong with that. But you have to learn to trust yourself again. So let's say you're doing all of this, you're doing the work, you're listening to this podcast, you're following this and some of the other episodes I've talked about these similar issues. And you're still wondering, okay, I've been in so many crappy, shitty relationships, some toxic, maybe some abusive. You're wondering what healthy connection actually feels like. So let's name it. What it feels like, it's predictable, it's steady, it's mutual, it's respectful. I didn't say it's easy. Notice I did not say there isn't conflict. Notice I didn't say it shouldn't be hard. Sometimes it's hard. It's absolutely hard sometimes. But these 5 things, predictability, steadiness, mutuality, respectfulness, and repairability, those are what you're looking for. There's room for disagreement without destruction. There's accountability without punishment. And there can be closeness without total collapse. It doesn't hijack your nervous system. And it doesn't consume your identity or get you to distrust your judgment. And it doesn't require you to abandon yourself in order to belong or feel connected to the other person. So let's say you're doing that work. The question then we're kind of move towards kind of wrapping up today is, what are the signs for when you know that moment that you know you're healing? When do you know you're on your path? Well, healing isn't when you stop remembering the bad things or you're remembering the things that were done that led to the toxic relationship. Healing is when you stop feeling pulled back into the pattern. You can still be aware, but you're not being pulled back into the pattern. There is a wonderful comment by the archetypal psychologist James Hillman. He has since passed in the last few years. He did a lot of work under Carl Jung. And if you don't know archetypal psychology, it's kind of like a neo-Jungian psychology approach to understanding the psyche and relationships. And he says, the problem with trauma is not that you were traumatized. The problem with trauma is that you are remembering it traumatically. Let me unpack that because it's really important. I think it's very much related to this question of how you know when you're healing and you're moving on. Most of us, maybe not all of us, but most of us have experienced a traumatic event in our life, and some more arguably or objectively more severe than others. And that will have an impact. I am not belittling post-traumatic stress disorder. I have a specialization in PTSD. I've worked with Vietnam vets. I've worked with sex abuse survivors. I've worked with victims of world torture in my clinical background. So I know that well. So I'm not belittling actual full-blown traumatic disorders. But even applied to that, and this is a direct, harsh, some might say it's a harsh statement. The real problem with trauma is not that you were traumatized. Many people are traumatized and they just bounce back from it. They absorb the blow, kind of like a grief process, and they bounce back, or they learn to actually embrace life more deeply. Albert Schweitzer is a great example. Coming out of the Holocaust, he learned to love and embrace life and went on to write philosophic pieces all about love and human connectedness. So the problem with trauma, though, is that we're stuck remembering it traumatically. And I'm not saying you could snap your fingers and suddenly just stop remembering it traumatically. Not at all. It takes work, a lot of work. You have to reset the nervous system. But in relationships, it is part of the pattern, right? So we're not saying you stop remembering what happened to you. It's when you stop being pulled back into the pattern. And that's what happens in trauma as well. We keep getting pulled back into a pattern, the trauma response, that allowed us to hit a fight or flight or fawn reaction that was adaptable back then, but is no longer adaptable, but we're still engaging in the same pattern. It's when you can recognize red flags early without obsessing over them. It's when you can say no without guilt. And it's when you can walk away without self-doubt. So that's the moment that you know that you're healing. It's when peace stops feeling suspicious and starts feeling deserved. Healing after toxic relationships doesn't mean becoming harder. It doesn't mean you're putting on more armor. We tend to think you got to get guarded. You got to close off. And this is another thing that drives me fucking nuts with so many coaches online. I think they mean well. I do. But many just don't have the coaching training or the clinical background to understand this nuance. Bouncing back or healing after toxic relationships doesn't mean you double up on your armor or you get harder. It means becoming clear about what you tolerate, clear about what you need, clear about what you no longer explain away and sacrifice for yourself or about yourself. You don't need thicker skin. You need better filters. I heard this somewhere and I love it. And I wish I could remember where I heard it from. You don't need thicker skin. You need better filters. And when those filters are in place, trust becomes possible again. And it starts with you first trusting yourself, trusting your judgment, trusting your discernment, and then it becomes trusting others. And not because you're naive. It's because now you're grounded. And that makes all the difference in the world. All right. Call to action. If today's episode resonated and you're ready to continue this work, I invite you to check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a practical, no bullshit guide to rebuilding self-trust, strengthening boundaries, and navigating relationships with clarity instead of fear. It's available now on Amazon. I'll drop a link in the show notes. You can also check out my website, www.theunstressedexec.com, or you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. And remember, insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn healing into momentum and clarity into confidence, coaching can be the catalyst. So reach out. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias. Thank you for listening. And remember, shift happens.